I'm a Blender artist and I've been animating my desktop icons. Why? Because I can. And I'm not stopping with just desktop icons, I'm doing even more video game icons. I picked 3 of, in my opinion, the all-time greats, and I got to work. And for the first one, there was only one obvious choice. I'm talking, of course, about Elder Scrolls Oblivion, the remaster.
Stop! You violated the law. Pay the court a fine or serve your sentence.
I knew right away that I wanted to blend the original icon with the new remastered icon, and I wanted to do that with animation. So I grabbed the original icon and I set about roughing out a model of the outside of it. And I just did this by setting up a very basic, low poly version of it, adding a subdivision surface modifier, and roughing out the basic shape of the logo. Then I did a technique that I like to call mid-poly modeling, and basically what this is once I have the rough shape of the object created, I apply the subdivision surface modifier, but not with a high level of division, usually with a division level of 1. That gives me enough topology to work with to add in some of the finer details, but still a low enough poly count that I can add another subdivision surface modifier on top, and I'll carry a lot of those details into bigger, better changes without having to do too much work. Nothing too complicated here, I'm just basically roughing in the detail that I couldn't do with just one level of subdivision. And while you watch that, I want to make a quick note. If my audio sounds kind of busted, that's because it is. The knowledge I have of Blender has become too powerful, and I've had to flee the Autodesk Mafia, who are out for my blood. And so I'm hiding out in the foothills of California, somewhere in a remote area, and I'm broadcasting from that bunker. No, actually, though, my audio studio is set up at a kitchen table right now because I'm moving, so bear with. With the basic modeling done, I went ahead and grabbed a reference for the remastered icon. And I started off by making a very simple mesh mask and putting that in its own collection so that I can use it to mask the rest of the scene. With this set of icons, I'm going for a little bit more of a flat isn't really the right word, it's not minimalist, but the background of the icon itself won't be 3D, but the scene contained within will be 3D. And to do that, I'm basically just going to trim each of the icons with a mask. So the icon is basically just a view into a little world of its own. And by this point, I'd had some time to think about how I want to transition between the original icon and the new icon. And what I came up with was this. I want to have the new icon be basically the same scene that's shown in the new icon with, maybe a little bit of tweaking here and there to make it fit my scene better, but overall the same basic vibe with the knight standing in the foreground holding his sword with the burning logo in the background and this sort of silhouetted, slightly visible, destroyed and burning castle. Maybe even a little smoke around the ground, just like in the example here. And to transition to that, what I want to do is have the sort of glowing cracks in the original icon heat up as if the icon is filling with magma from inside or building in intensity until it gets super bright, and then I want the central part of the icon to explode. And I want the fireball from that explosion to envelop the whole camera for a second, basically cover the entire icon. And that explosion will provide me the cover to transition between the old scene, which is just the icon against black, and the new scene, which is all of this complicated detail. And I'm kind of sketching this out with the annotation tool so that I can go ahead and have some references when I'm placing my parts. Now, I could go ahead and model the castle and the knight and the sword and the shield and all of that stuff from scratch, but that would take an unbelievably long amount of time, and I want this video to come out sometime this month. So instead, I'm going to start with assets from Sketchfab and CG Trader, and I'll make sure I link those in the description of the video, and I'm going to go ahead and modify those to suit my needs. For the castle, there's really not much modification I need to do. Basically just put it into the scene, roughly where I think it should go, put some fire on it, which we'll get to in a little bit, and, light it effectively so that it doesn't look like it's broad daylight. For the foreground, I was able to just jump into my existing asset library and grab a rock area that I already had and just kind of try a few of those out till I found what I was happy with and bring that in and make it what my knight is going to be standing on. Remember, as a 3D artist, one of the biggest advantages that you'll have when you're compiling a scene, especially a complicated environment scene, is if you know what your camera placement is going to be ahead of time, you can build your scene to camera. And that's really wonderful because it means you only have to build the stuff that's in view, and you can do lots and lots of forced perspective tricks. For example, my foreground and castle are not remotely to scale. The foreground is big enough to be present where I need it to be, and the castle is actually shrunk down and much closer to the camera than it would be if it was a realistic scale. but it makes it much easier to handle the assets and place all of the fire and stuff that I'll be doing later on. I came back to the logo to create a simple rock material, and I did that by just taking an existing rock material that I had, darkening it a little bit, and then grabbing the roughness map and pulling that through a color ramp so that I could get the veins from the rock isolated, and use those to blend between my original rock material and a orange emissive material. And I'm just using a black body to control the color of that emissive, and a simple emission shader to control the brightness. And I'm going to then animate that so that it goes from a mild glow like in the original logo to overwhelmingly bright as if it's about to explode, and then the explosion itself. For the night model, I grabbed one that was on Mixamo that was close enough to what I wanted, and I plan to just modify the helmet and replace it with one that's much closer to the one from Oblivion. I also downloaded several different animations, which I think I'll string together in a compelling way to have the knight move around in the scene when it's finished. With those animations brought into Blender, I set them up as actions so that I can use them as strips in the nonlinear editor. And what this means is I can basically paste the animation for each of these discrete animations and set up little blending elements between them so that they blend together. And it means I can have the character do something like go from a sword swinging animation to an idle animation seamlessly, even though originally those were two separate animation files. If you're someone like me who's trying to get better at animation, but also needs lots of really complicated character animations relatively frequently and doesn't want to do all of that by hand, I highly recommend learning how to use the action editor and learning how to use predefined motion capture data with it. And I say that because I'm still learning. I'm no doctor, but that really doesn't look right. You know what else looks wrong? These viewership to subscription numbers. Like 90% of you aren't subscribed. We should change that. So, go do your thing. Now that I've fixed his bones, I have the animations that I want set up with a little bit of blending in between. So now the character goes from swinging and examining his sword to a idle animation where he's still holding the sword and shield in a braced position, but he's still moving around a little bit so that it doesn't look like he's just a mannequin. Now it's time for the fun part, the explosions. And I started by using the cell fracture tool on the center part of the icon and setting a simple force emitter. And with it fractured, I set each of the various fractured pieces as a rigid body and added a simple force field and a turbulence field to push them apart and have them tumble. Then I added and keyed a light that emits from the center of the object as it explodes, so it looks like there's a bright flash at the center of the explosion. With the simple part of the explosion done, I went back to working on the knight. This time, I wanted to convert the materials for the armor, the tunic, and his face to be something other than this relatively flat basic material that the object comes with. To do that, I just split the portions of the armor that would be metal into their own material layer and assigned a very basic flat material for the skin and the tunic. This isn't going to be in very bright light, so I don't need a ton of realism from the skin, and I actually ended up making it dark later so that you can't even see it within the helmet anyway. And for the armor, all I did was disconnect the pre-canned metallic that came with it and turn the metallic all the way up. And then I dropped the roughness just a little bit so that we can get some nice metal reflection going. Then it was time to tackle the helmet, and for that I just started with a simple UV sphere, cut it in half, and went ahead and just roughed in the other basic shapes by just extruding various planes. For the rivets, I just used little half spheres, and I created a collection instance of those, made a bunch of them, made the instances real, and joined them all as one object with a mirror modifier on it. And with all of that wrapped up, I just threw a very basic metal material that I already had in my material library onto it, and modified it slightly so that the luster and darkness of the metal match the rest of the armor. Then to attach it to his head, I used a simple child of constraint, and I set the target to the armature that's controlling our knight, and the target bone to his head. I don't know if it bears repeating, but as you watch this, just take the constant reminder that I try and give for every single video that at the end of the day, everything is just a very basic set of roughed out primitives and extruded planes, faces, and vertices. Nothing is as complicated as you are maybe making it out to be in your head, and remember, if you feel like you're overcomplicating things, you probably are, and there's probably an easier way to do it by just making the thing out of cubes and spheres. And now, with the knight basically roughed out, it's time to go back to doing our explosion. And wouldn't you know it, I happen to have a few of those on hand too in my library. See, Blender can now use a cool new thing called VDBs. VDBs are a file format that lets you store voxel data, and you can actually store sequences of voxel data too. And a voxel is basically just a 3D pixel, and it's how you define a fluid simulation. So each cell of the fluid is a single voxel. And With the ability to store this, plus the information about temperature, flames, and other things that your various fluid simulators can bake into an explosion, you can now transport those explosions to a whole bunch of different 3D softwares whenever you want. So whenever I create a really cool explosion in Blender, in Embergen, or any other fluid simulator, if I really want to keep it, I will bake it out as a VDB and store it somewhere. Now, VDBs are not small, so this does take up a fair amount of storage space, so that's something to keep in mind if you ever plan to do this. But man, is it ever helpful to have a whole bunch of pre-canned explosions on hand, rather than having to go through the hassle of simulating one every time I want something to blow up. Which is a lot. I make a lot of stuff blow up. I went ahead and stored the original VDB in its own collection and hid it, and I added a collection instance. And the reason I'm doing that is the VDBs are very cool, but a lot of the cursor snapping tools, especially the stuff with the dynamic context menu, doesn't seem to work well with VDBs yet, but it works just fine with collection instances. And because I rely on cursor snapping all the time, it's really annoying to not have that. The other reason is if I, for some reason, want multiple versions of this explosion, it's much easier on the render engine to have instances of them rather than duplicates. For the material, I started with a basic principled volume, and I grabbed a material that I'd constructed for another project, and that basically just lifts the flame data, temperature data, and density data, runs them through a few different color ramps so that I can control for color, density, and basically any other property that I'd want, and then pipes them out to the explosion. And I find that this gives you a really fine degree of control over what you want to do with your explosion, and I'll put that up on the screen here so you can see what the material looks like. And it gets me really good results that I'm quite happy with. I also went ahead and added some glare in the real-time compositor because I'm working in Eevee, and I think the glare makes things just look better in general. And then I went on to dealing with the fire. Before I could put the background fire in though, I had to make my night disappear. And I could do some kind of complicated material blending, but because I have this convenient explosion that I set up hiding half of the scene, instead I just keyed the visibility. So as the explosion covers the night, the render visibility turns on. Before that, he's gone. As soon as the explosion is covering where he will be, he becomes visible. But because the explosion's there, you can't see it, and it perfectly seamlessly hides the transition. This is another thing that I want to come back to for animating all the time. A lot of stuff that you'll see, both in original animations, my animations, and even all the way up to the level of something like Pixar, are going to use tricks and sleight of hand like this to hide transitions between stuff. You know, sometimes you'll have a character pick up an object, and what's actually happening is there's two of the same object in the same spot, and one of them's parented to the character, and the other's parented to the table or whatever. Sometimes it's something like this horrifying stuff from Pixar, where they just mushed the character's face around in the background so that they could get the right expression, and it doesn't make sense to build an entire rig just to do, one facial expression. So if you think that it looks like something was an interesting way to cheat things, it probably was. Moving on to the fire in the background, I once again used a VDB that I already had and assigned my material to it. I just made a duplicate of the material so that I could make further adjustments to make it look more fire and smoke plume-like and less explosion-like. And that's just adjusting the color hue a little bit and adjusting the controls that I set up to blend between smoke and fire to give it a little bit more smoke and a little bit less fire. And for that one, I also had the VDB in its own collection, which is disabled, and the plumes that you're seeing are actually instances because, I want 3 of these things, but they're different sizes, and I can get away with using the same fire over and over and over again, and that saves me time and effort, and it also, renders quicker. And for the lighting, I just added a handful of red tinted point lights around where the fire emitters are, and I linked those all so that I can set the controls on one, and all of them will just adapt to be the same as whatever setting I have done on one of them. That way I only have to ever change one light at a time, which makes things easier. And then it was time to do the logo. And that one I can't use pre-canned fire for. Luckily I have Embergen, but even still, this was a long process. I'm showing you the end result, but the reality is what I ended up doing that finally worked was starting with one of their fire presets that I liked, and instead of emitting it from a existing Embergen object, I exported an FBX of just the outside of the logo, and I used the import node to import that into Embergen. And then I used it as the surface for the fire emitter. But then I also had to make changes to the domain size. I had to add a wind node in to just give it a little bit of a breeze because, in the example, it's kind of going one direction, and I think it's a little more dynamic to have that. I messed around with the noise to get the fire to be kind of noisy for ages. And, the reality is this is a, 20, 30-minute video, whatever, but I spent probably a solid 2.5 or 3 hours at 11 o'clock at night fiddling with these. So, if you feel disheartened when you're working on your project and you're going, oh my God, ByteDozer does this stuff so quickly. No, I don't. I edit it down, and through the magic of editing, my hours and hours of screaming at my computer are reduced into 5 minutes. I did eventually get it working, and I was pretty happy with the end result. And through the magic of VTB, I was able to export it as a VTB and just bring it right into Blender. And I did basically the same thing I did with my other explosions from that point. And I set up the simple material, tweaked it a little bit so that the flames are much more prominent, but the basis of the material is the same as all of the other ones. And finally, I grabbed a cool shield and cool sword model that I found again on CG Trader, and I added some simple metal materials that I already had on them. And then I used the same parenting trick I used for the helmet, but this time instead of attaching the shield and sword to his head, because that wouldn't make any sense, I attached them to each of the guy's hands. And I basically placed them first and then set up the constraint. So now as the character moves, they move along with his hands. And I think it looks pretty damn good, honestly. I did the same hide and show transition that I did for the body of the knight, for the shield, the sword, and the burning logo and the original logo, so that the burning logo replaces the original logo in the midst of that explosion, and the sword, shield, helmet, and knight all appear at the same time. I also ended up changing the color management settings for the entire scene because I just couldn't get the results that I wanted from AGX. I really wanted the scene to have this really bright pop of super saturated color, but also these really dark darks. And AGX is very realistic, but what that means is as the light gets brighter, the colors tend to desaturate, and so I just couldn't get the range that I wanted. So I ended up just using a filmic with a sort of a punchy look to it, and it was very simple, but it let me get that bright orange that I really, really wanted. One other thing to note, to get the night to light up without lighting up the background, and I don't mean the night is in the dark of the night, but the knight in shining armor guy, I wanted to have a light on him, but I didn't want that light to light up the ground or the castle or any of the other stuff. And to do that, I ended up using light linking, which is now in Eevee and is absolutely amazing. And basically what it means is you can say, I want this light to only affect one object, and you can specify which object. You can also do multiple objects with that light, but basically it gives you total control over what your lights light up. And that way I can have a very bright, primary light on the night and not have it affect anything else, which is amazing. Anyway, hours of fiddling with this later that I'm going to pretend that I didn't do because I'm just that good, I got something that I was happy with, and I ended up rendering it out to see what it would look like on the dock. And here it is. What do you think? I'm pretty happy with it, but let me know what you think in the comments. That's not the only one. I kept going. And this one actually, interestingly enough, is from comments. A lot of you guys said I should do Portal 2. It's one of my favorite games, so something I'd consider it anyway. But your comments convinced me that I should do it for this one because I do think it's one of the greatest games of all time. And this one I had actually kind of formulated a plan for. I knew I wanted a portal in there, and I knew I wanted it to be more 3D than this simplistic logo, but I also wanted to refer to it because I didn't want to, lose the original logo entirely. So what I decided to do is have the line that represents the portal, have the character and the two go back inside of that line, and then have the line turn 90 degrees to reveal a portal and show a scene from something inside of Aperture Laboratories that would maybe startle you, and I put something fun in there, and we'll get to that in a minute. And the portal would basically show that scene for a little bit, and then it would turn back, and the character and the two would come back out of it so that the logo animation is a perfect loop. And to start this, obviously I had to make my simple portal. So I just used a circle and scaled it upwards to be sort of an oval, added a 2 that was just basic text, and then for the character, I just made it out of simple primitives with a circle for the head and a rectangular plane for the body that I just extruded outward and beveled to make the arms and legs. I only even bothered to make the right arm and the right leg because, again, I know the character is going to just duck back into the portal, and what's visible of the character now is the maximum amount that's going to be visible for the entire animation. So why make stuff that's never going to show up? And then I had to start thinking about how to go about hiding the two and the characters so they can both disappear into a line that is simply an oval. And I'm going to do that by using masks, but I'm going to have to offset the masks in front and behind the character in the two so that it can hide them retrospectively without interfering with the other mask. And this took me a couple tries to figure out. But what I opted to do is have the render visibility of one of the masks hidden while the other is active. So the character can slide in and be hidden by the first mask, and then the second mask that would have masked the character out when it was visible can appear because the character is no longer there anyway, so it doesn't matter if the mask is there. And then the two can slide behind that mask and be masked by that. And I'd be lying if I didn't tell you I was kind of gloating and feeling very proud of myself when this worked correctly. Then the next stage was to animate my simple 90-degree rotation of the portal and get to working on the material for the portal, which was anything but simple. And I basically found and modified an existing material setup. I didn't just copy it from their blend file, but I used the same principles that they used in their creation to make a portal mask that basically relies on the length of the UV map to create a mask around the edge, and then a gradient setup that lets me basically animate a random bit of noise around the edge. And that's basically the base of the setup that I'm going to use to animate this sort of swirling outside part of the portal. For the actual portal part, we'll get to that in a second because it's very clever. But for now, I just need to get this noise setup working, which took me a little bit of fiddling. And for the record, this setup comes from fellow Blender YouTuber and certified technical art genius Cartesian Camel, and definitely go check out their YouTube channel. It is just jam-packed full of amazing information about Blender. But yeah, with some fiddling, I got the basics of this material down, and I even got my swirl working using this frame value driver setup, which basically just uses a driver based on the current frame to automatically drive the animation so that as you play the animation, it just looks at the frame number and uses that information to move the swirling circle. That way I don't have to go about keying it or fiddle with keyframes for it. It all happens automatically. Drivers are actually something I only recently learned in my effort to really live by my channel's motto of never stop learning. And man, I really wish it's something I'd picked up sooner. And that push to continuously learn more and more about Blender and just everything in general is also why this video is sponsored by Brilliant. Brilliant is a learning app that helps you get smarter every single day. They have tons of interactive lessons in science, math, and more. I personally really like Brilliant because rather than just teaching you to memorize the solutions to your problems, they structure the lessons to break down complex topics into much more manageable, smaller chunks that teach you the actual concepts. I've been taking some of their Python courses, and they're helping me take my programming skills to a point where I can confidently approach my projects now. If you want to try out Brilliant, you can get everything they have to offer for free for a full 30 days if you go to my link, brilliant.org/bytedozer, or you can scan the QR code that I have on screen here, or you can click the link that'll be in the description below. Also, if you sign up with that link, you'll get 20% off their annual premium subscription, so definitely give it a look. And for the inside, I was going to use the actual way of portaling stuff in Blender. And by that, of course, I mean the ray portal. I mean, it's literally in the name. And the ray portal node works by intercepting rays that are hitting the surface that the material is on and sending them to a new place. And the way it determines what that new place is based on the inputs that you give it for direction and position. And in my case, it was actually a very simple matter of offsetting that position to match the equivalent camera position of another scene that I set up right next to the scene that is not visible on the camera. So basically I just, a meter or two away, I made a whole other scene that I want to be visible through my portal, and I set a fake camera. I just used an empty for this so that I could get the information about where it was, basically 2 meters away to the right of my real camera. And I just set up that empty's position as the new position for those rays. And what that means is, rather than hitting my original object, the rays now pass through, reappear at the new empty position, and hit the new scene. And effectively what that means is, instead of drawing the center of the portal as a flat plane, which it is, it draws the other scene instead. And I temporarily used a monkey and a basic light for this. But then, once it was working, I went ahead and started filling in the actual scene that I want. And for the surprise inside the portal, a turret, of course. It wouldn't be Portal without a turret. And again, this is another asset that I grabbed, and I'll have links for those in the description of the video, so if you happen to need a Portal turret for whatever reason, go ahead and grab that. And this one very conveniently came rigged already. So basically the way I wanted to set it up was to have it so that when the portal turns and you see the turret locks onto you, alerts, opens the gun bays as if it's going to shoot you, and then a companion cube falls in at the last second, lands in front of the turret, blocks it to view, and saves you. So to do that, I just made simple animations of the gun bays opening and closing at the right times, and then I went ahead and grabbed a companion cube asset, updated the materials to be a little bit more fun. They're just a little shiny for the white material, a little shiny for the gray material, and then I actually made the heart part and the little lines glow because I thought it looked cool. And I went ahead and set the ground as a collider and the companion cube as a physics object, and I just simulated it dropping down a few times until I had a look that I was happy with. And that way, the gun bays pop open, the cube drops in front of you and saves you, and the gun bays close again, and then the portal turns back around. And with all that wrapped up, all that was left was to add a simple material to the character and the two, just to have those glow a cool blue and, effectively represent that logo. And then I just did a little bit of fiddling with the retiming of the animation to make sure everything was good, and I went ahead and rendered it out. And here's what it looks like as an actual application on the dock.
Are you still there?
And last but certainly not least, one of the other greatest games of all time, PubG. I had to do this because the Battle Royale format is just unbelievably undefeated, and this is one of the games that really kicked the whole thing off. And it's still one of the most popular games of all time. And I decided I want the basic animation to be the PUBG character standing in a sort of idle animation, unholstering a gun from his belt, shooting off screen, and then gigantic explosions appearing behind him, and then he reholsters the gun casually as if nothing happened because he's just that cool. I got lucky again with the assets in that I found a cool PUBG character in T-pose that looked like it was good, had pretty good textures, wasn't native to Blender, so I knew I'd have to do a little bit of messing with the materials, but overall it worked. The one bummer is it wasn't rigged. So the first thing I did was take that character and upload it in T-pose to Mixamo and use their auto rigger to rig it. Then I grabbed a gun drawing and firing animation that I liked, brought it back down as an FBX, and brought it into Blender. And that's how I got to this point here, where I have the blank character drawing and firing a gun, but there's still some work to be done because none of the materials are on the character. So the first thing I had to do was re-link all of the textures to the various materials that the character has. Then I had to make some adjustments to those materials so that they're not all shiny. The entire character isn't made out of meat like it is when I first started, which is nightmare fuel, honestly. And everything is where it should be. And none of this is super complicated, it's just tedious. There's lots of just making sure that I have the right texture assigned to the right texture slot, making sure the right materials are assigned to the right material slots. Lots and lots of fiddling, nothing that really requires a lot of brain work, but it just has to be done. With that out of the way, and you having the benefit of me being able to fast forward things, and me not having that benefit, I went ahead and also grabbed a gun model, and I wanted to have him draw it from his holster, fire the gun off screen, have some big explosions happen behind the character, like I said, and then put the gun back. And you'd think this would be easy, but it's actually deceptively difficult, because what I have to do here is have two separate parent constraints. One that's constraining the gun to the gun belt, and then a separate one that's constraining the gun to the hand. And it's important that I have those child of constraints set in the right order, and that I key the influence between them so that the gun attaches to the hand at the exact moment that it's detaching from the belt. And if I don't do that and set my inverses correctly so that the gun never changes position, the gun will snap all over the place and it'll look crazy and it just won't look right. So even though I'm not animating the character at all, and all I'm doing is blending between two parent constraints, I probably fiddled with this for a solid 20 or 30 minutes until it looked right. I did finally get it finished though, and get it to something that I was happy with, and so I moved on to grabbing an AK, attaching that to his back, and that one was easy. I just applied a simple constraint to one of his spine bones. Much easier when you only have one constraint you're dealing with. It's amazing how much more complex it gets when you have to blend between two of them. And then the final elements of this were the background, which I just grabbed a cool, sky and pasture texture off of Unsplash, which is an amazing resource. I recommend both Unsplash and Pexels to anyone that hasn't used them. They're basically just websites with tons of free images and videos that are CC0. I use them for backgrounds and video textures all the time. And I put that in so that it looks like the sky in the original logo. And finally, the explosions. And I suppose having watched the beginning of this video, you would think, oh, you're going to use VDB explosions. But remember, volumes, even in Eevee, take a long time to render. And for something like this, where the camera isn't moving at all, and we don't have the same thing going that we had with the Oblivion logo, where the character itself is enveloped by the explosion, we don't actually need to use a 3D explosion. I happen to have the Action Essentials 2 library, which is a gigantic library of pre-keyed explosions and effects. But if you don't have Action Essentials 2, there's lots and lots of free ones online that you can download as well. And what I did here is basically download it as the keyed version of the video and just use the alpha channel to blend between an emissive material that is emitting the explosion and a transparent material, which is just the parts of the explosion that aren't visible. And what that means is I have a video texture card where only parts of the video are visible, and the only parts that are visible are the explosion itself. The rest is transparent. So if I put that texture card in between my character and the background, I get these cool explosions that appear, and you can see the background behind them. And the advantage of this is I can duplicate this a couple times, and because it's a texture, I can control effectively exactly when the explosion starts, and because it's a texture, it doesn't take ages to render. So of the three, this one rendered by far the fastest. And it's something that I wanted to do in this one because it's something that I'd like to encourage you to do if you have a scene where your explosions aren't going to be seen from multiple angles and they don't have to envelop anything or really block anything in a significant way. Always keep in mind, if you can do something with texture cards or video cards, it's much faster to do that than with a 3D volume. Anyway, besides the god-awful fiddling with the gun part, this one was by far the simplest of the three. And I'm actually very happy with how it turned out. Here's how it looks on the dock. And that's it for this one, which means it's time for me to do my normal spiel. 1, if you can afford it, donate to the Blender Foundation. They need the money. They're amazing. Obviously, this goes without saying, but I'm going to say it anyway. 2, comment. Let me know what you think I should do next. It doesn't even have to be icons, but if you have an idea for an icon, let me know what it is. And finally, and as always, never stop learning.